The day we divided Grandpa's farm equipment was the day I realized my brother Marcus had always seen me as the lesser son. We stood in the equipment barn, surrounded by decades of accumulated machinery, and Marcus methodically claimed everything of value while I watched my inheritance disappear. "I'll take the new John Deere 8R series," he said, making notes on his tablet. "The Case Combine Harvester, the Kubota utility tractor, and all the implements that go with them." Marcus had always been the successful one, the brother who'd gone to business school, made millions in real estate development, and lived in a mansion in the city. He visited Grandpa maybe twice a year, usually bringing expensive gifts that sat unused while making polite conversation about crops and weather he didn't understand. I was the one who'd stayed local, worked construction, and spent every weekend helping Grandpa maintain the farm. I'd been there for the late-night emergencies, the equipment breakdowns, and the quiet conversations on the porch after long days of work. But none of that seemed to matter when it came time to divide the estate. Marcus had the legal right to claim half of everything, and he was taking the half that included all the valuable modern equipment. "What about that old tractor in the corner?" I asked, pointing to Grandpa's 1948 John Deere Model B that had been sitting unused for 20 years. Marcus laughed, not bothering to look up from his tablet. "Keep your junk tractor," he said dismissively. "It hasn't run since I was in high school, and it's probably worth more as scrap metal than as farm equipment." The old John Deere was indeed a sorry sight. Rust-stained, flat tires, and covered in dust and cobwebs. But it had been Grandpa's first tractor, the machine he'd used to start farming when he came back from World War II. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It might be worth restoring." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Take it. I've got no use for antiques." Chapter 2. The Restoration Project. After Marcus left with his convoy of trucks loaded with modern equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, I stood alone in the barn looking at my inheritance, one broken-down tractor that most people would consider worthless. But I'd learned enough about mechanics from Grandpa to know that the old John Deere Model B was actually a well-built machine that could probably be restored with patience and effort. More importantly, it represented a connection to Grandpa's history that I wasn't ready to abandon. I spent the next 3 months working on the tractor every evening after my construction job. I rebuilt the engine, replaced the hydraulic lines, and painstakingly restored each component to working condition. The project became my therapy, a way to feel connected to Grandpa while dealing with the grief of losing him and the resentment of watching Marcus walk away with everything valuable. The tractor had been built in 1948, the same year Grandpa had returned from the war and started farming. According to the serial number, it was one of the first Model B tractors produced after John Deere resumed civilian production following the war years. As I worked on the restoration, I found evidence of Grandpa's meticulous care over the decades. Every bolt had been properly maintained, every component had been regularly serviced, and even after 20 years of sitting idle, the basic structure was sound. The most intriguing discovery was the radio mounted on the dashboard, an aftermarket addition that Grandpa had installed sometime in the 1950s. It was a simple AM radio with vacuum tubes and analog controls, the kind that farmers use to listen to weather reports and market prices while working in the field. I'd assumed the radio was long dead, but when I tested the electrical system, I found that it still had power. The vacuum tubes glowed when I turned it on, though I couldn't pick up any stations through the static. I made a mental note to work on the radio after I got the engine running properly. Chapter 3. The First Start. Getting the engine to turn over took weeks of patient work. The cylinders had seized from years of inactivity, and I had to carefully free each piston with penetrating oil and gentle persuasion. The carburetor needed complete rebuilding, and several gaskets had to be replaced. But finally, on a crisp October morning, I was ready to attempt the first start. I'd invited my neighbor Tom Bradley to witness the moment, partly because I wanted someone there to share the achievement, and partly because I needed a witness in case something went wrong. "You sure that thing's safe to start?" Tom asked, eyeing the old tractor skeptically. "It's been sitting here since before my kids were born." I'd checked and double-checked every system, but there's always uncertainty when starting an engine that's been dormant for 2 decades. I set the choke, primed the carburetor, and pulled the starter rope. The engine turned over slowly, coughed once, then fell silent. I adjusted the settings and tried again. This time, the engine caught and ran for a few seconds before dying. On the third attempt, the old John Deere roared to life with a sound that was both mechanical and musical. The exhaust stack puffed black smoke for a moment, then settled into the steady rhythm that had once been familiar throughout the county. Tom was grinning as he listened to the engine. "That's the sound I remember from when I was a kid," he said. "Your grandpa used to start this thing every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. As the engine warmed up, I decided to test the radio. I turned the dial and was surprised to hear it crackling to life, the vacuum tubes glowing brighter as they warmed up. Most of what came through was static, but I could occasionally catch fragments of distant AM stations. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. Through the static, I heard a voice I recognized, my grandfather's voice, speaking as clearly as if he were sitting next to me. Chapter 4. Grandpa's Voice. If you're hearing this, Tommy, it means you got the old girl running again. I nearly fell off the tractor seat. Tom's eyes went wide as he heard it too. There was no mistaking Grandpa's distinctive voice coming through the radio speakers. "I know you're probably wondering how this is possible," the voice continued, "and I'll explain that in a minute. But first, I want you to know how proud I am that you took the time to restore this tractor. Your brother saw it as junk, but you understood its real value." My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio controls, but I was afraid to touch anything that might interrupt whatever was happening. "This radio has been modified in ways that Marcus never knew about," Grandpa's voice explained. "During my time in the Army Signal Corps, I learned about electronics and radio technology that wasn't available to civilians. I've been using this radio to record messages for over 30 years, waiting for the right person to hear them." Tom was staring at the radio in amazement. "How is this possible?" he whispered. Grandpa's voice seemed to hear the question. "The radio is connected to a recording device hidden in the tractor's frame," he explained. "It's voice-activated and has been documenting conversations and storing messages since 1955. But it only plays back when the engine is running at exactly the right temperature and RPM." The technical explanation was fascinating, but I was more interested in why Grandpa had gone to such elaborate lengths to create this hidden communication system. "I have things to tell you, Tommy, that I couldn't share while I was alive," the voice continued. "Secrets about our family, about this farm, and about why I really left you that old tractor instead of something more valuable." The radio crackled with static for a moment. Then Grandpa's voice returned with a tone that was both serious and urgent. "But before I tell you those secrets, you need to understand that Marcus can never know about this radio or what it contains. Some family secrets are meant to stay secret, and some knowledge can be dangerous in the wrong hands." Chapter 5. The Hidden History. Over the next hour, Grandpa's voice told me a story about our family that I'd never heard before. The radio contained dozens of recorded messages, apparently triggered by different engine conditions and operating parameters that Grandpa had programmed over the years. "Our family's connection to this land goes back further than anyone knows," his voice explained. "When I bought this farm in 1948, I wasn't just buying agricultural property. I was reclaiming land that had belonged to our ancestors before the Civil War. According to Grandpa's recordings, our great-great-grandfather had owned over 2,000 acres in this area before losing it during the economic chaos that followed the war. The family had been forced to sell the land for a fraction of its value and had spent the next 80 years working as tenant farmers on property that had once been theirs. I spent my entire adult life buying back pieces of our original holdings," Grandpa continued. "Every acre I purchased was part of a larger plan to restore our family's legacy, but I could never tell anyone about it because there were people who would have tried to stop me." The recordings revealed that Grandpa had been much more than a simple farmer. He'd been a strategic land investor who had carefully assembled a portfolio of properties that recreated much of the original family estate. "The farm that Marcus thinks he inherited is just the visible part of what I built," Grandpa's voice said. "The real wealth is in the properties I acquired under different names, through shell companies and trust funds that I established over the decades." Tom was listening in stunned silence as Grandpa's voice described a complex network of land holdings, mineral rights, and business investments that had been hidden from the family for generations. "I couldn't trust this information to a will or legal documents," the voice explained. Too many people would have had access to it, and too many of them had reasons to prevent our family from reclaiming what was rightfully ours. The radio crackled again, and when Grandpa's voice returned, it carried a weight of emotion that made my chest tight. I'm leaving this knowledge to you, Tommy, because you're the only one who understood the real value of this old tractor. Chapter 6. The Treasure Map. As the recordings continued, Grandpa's voice began describing the specific locations and details of the hidden properties he'd acquired. The radio seemed to have an extensive memory system that could access different recordings based on various triggers. In the glove compartment of this tractor, you'll find a key, his voice instructed. That key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in the county seat. The box contains maps, deeds, and financial documents that will show you the full extent of what I've assembled. I reached into the glove compartment and found an old brass key wrapped in oilcloth, exactly where Grandpa had said it would be. The properties I acquired include the original homestead where our family lived before the Civil War, the voice continued. It's now a 400-acre tract that includes mineral rights worth millions of dollars. There's also the old mill site, which is now zoned for commercial development, and several parcels along the river that have significant timber value. Tom was shaking his head in amazement. Your grandfather was playing a much deeper game than any of us realized, he said. The recordings revealed that Grandpa had spent over 50 years methodically buying back pieces of the family's original holdings, often paying above market prices to ensure that sellers would accept his offers. He'd used different names and business entities to prevent anyone from recognizing the pattern of his purchases. The total value of these properties is over $20 million, Grandpa's voice said. But more importantly, they represent the restoration of our family's rightful place in this community. The radio then began providing specific instructions for how to access and manage these hidden assets. There were account numbers, contact information for lawyers and financial advisors, and detailed explanations of the legal structures Grandpa had created to protect the properties. Marcus chose the modern equipment because he thought it was more valuable, the voice said with what sounded like amusement. But you chose the old tractor because you understood its history and significance. That choice tells me you're ready to be the steward of our family's true legacy. Chapter 7. The Safety Deposit Box. The next morning, I drove to the county seat with the brass key, my mind still reeling from everything I'd heard through the tractor's radio. Tom had agreed to come with me as a witness, both of us struggling to process the magnitude of what Grandpa had revealed. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, had known Grandpa for decades and wasn't surprised to see me with his key. Walter told me years ago that someone from his family would eventually come for this box, she said as she led us to the vault. He was very specific that only the person with the key should have access. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, filled with manila folders containing documents that represented decades of careful planning and strategic investment. The first folder contained a detailed map showing all of Grandpa's hidden property acquisitions, with each parcel marked and annotated with purchase dates and current values. The scope of his holdings was breathtaking. He'd reassembled nearly 1/800 acres of the original family estate, including properties that were now worth far more than their agricultural value due to development potential and mineral rights. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to a folder labeled Mineral Rights. "Your grandfather owned the subsurface rights to half the county." The mineral rights documents showed that Grandpa had been collecting royalty payments from oil and gas extraction for over 20 years. The annual income from these rights alone was more than most people earned in their entire careers. But the most significant discovery was a folder containing the original deed to our family's pre-Civil War homestead. Grandpa had managed to buy back the exact property where our ancestors had lived and farmed for generations before losing it to economic hardship. "This changes everything," I said, looking at the documents that proved I was now one of the largest landowners in the county. "Marcus has no idea what he walked away from when he dismissed that old tractor." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Your grandfather was one of the smartest men I ever knew," she said. "He understood that real wealth isn't always visible, and that the most valuable things are often the ones that other people overlook." Chapter 8. The Legal Framework. The documents in the safety deposit box revealed that Grandpa had created an intricate legal framework to protect and manage his hidden assets. He'd established multiple trusts, limited liability companies, and partnerships that had allowed him to acquire property without revealing his identity or intentions. "Everything has been structured to transfer seamlessly to you upon my death," one of his written instructions explained. "The lawyers and financial advisors who helped me create these entities have been paid in advance and are waiting for your contact." I found business cards for attorneys, accountants, and property managers in 3 different states, all of whom had been working with Grandpa for years to manage his hidden empire. The level of sophistication was far beyond anything I'd imagined a simple farmer could create. The most impressive aspect of his planning was how he'd anticipated and prepared for every possible complication. There were contingency plans for tax issues, family disputes, and even potential challenges to his ownership of various properties. "I've spent 30 years making sure that everything would be legally bulletproof," his notes explained. "No one can challenge your ownership of these assets, and no one can force you to reveal their existence if you choose to keep them secret." Tom was studying a folder containing financial statements that showed the current value and income potential of each property. "This is like finding out your grandfather was secretly a real estate mogul," he said. "The annual income from these properties is more than most small towns generate." But Grandpa's planning went beyond just accumulating wealth. The documents showed that he'd been using the income from his hidden properties to quietly support local charities, fund scholarships, and help struggling farmers in the community. He was like a secret philanthropist, I realized, reading through records of anonymous donations and low-interest loans he'd provided to neighbors who never knew where the help was coming from. The radio in the old tractor had been just the beginning. It was the key to unlocking a legacy that would allow me to continue Grandpa's work while building something even greater for future generations. Chapter 9. Marcus Finds Out. I managed to keep Grandpa's secret for almost 2 months while I worked with his attorneys and financial advisors to understand the full scope of my inheritance. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. Marcus found out about the hidden properties when he tried to develop some land adjacent to the farm and discovered that I owned the mineral rights to the area he wanted to build on. His real estate attorney had done a title search and found my name on documents that Marcus didn't understand. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, storming into my house with a stack of legal papers. "Since when do you own mineral rights to half the county?" I'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that Marcus would eventually discover at least part of what Grandpa had left me. But I was prepared for his anger and his inevitable demand for a share of the hidden wealth. "Grandpa left me more than just an old tractor," I said simply. "He'd been acquiring properties for decades, and he left them all to me." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally rage, as he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd missed. "This is impossible," he said, his voice rising. "Dad would have told me if he owned all this land. We would have included it in the estate division." I explained about the radio in the tractor and the safety deposit box, though I didn't reveal all the details of Grandpa's recording system. Marcus listened with growing fury as he realized that his dismissal of the junk tractor had cost him millions of dollars. "You manipulated him," Marcus accused. "You spent all that time with him, working on his farm, convincing him to hide assets from the family." "I had no idea any of this existed until I restored the tractor," I replied. "Grandpa made these decisions on his own, based on his own criteria for who should inherit what." Marcus spent the next hour demanding to see documents, threatening legal action, and insisting that he deserved half of everything I'd inherited. Chapter 10. The Brothers' Lawsuit. Marcus hired an expensive law firm to challenge Grandpa's hidden bequests, claiming that the family had been defrauded and that the estate should be reopened to include all of Grandpa's assets. His lawyers argued that hiding substantial assets from the family constituted fraud, and that the inheritance should be redistributed equally. But Grandpa's legal framework proved to be as bulletproof as he'd promised. His attorneys had anticipated exactly this scenario and had structured everything to withstand challenges from family members who felt they'd been cheated. "Your grandfather was very specific about his intentions," my lawyer explained during one of our strategy meetings. He wanted to reward the family member who showed genuine appreciation for his values and history, not just his financial assets. The legal battle dragged on for 6 months, with Marcus spending tens of thousands of dollars trying to prove that he deserved a share of properties he'd never known existed. His lawyers deposed me, examined the tractor and its radio system, and tried to find any evidence of fraud or manipulation. But the more they investigated, the stronger my position became. Grandpa's records showed decades of careful planning and legal compliance. Every property had been acquired legitimately, every document had been properly filed, and every transfer had been structured according to applicable laws. The most damaging evidence for Marcus's case came from Grandpa's own recordings, which clearly explained his reasoning for keeping the property secret and his criteria for choosing an heir. Marcus chose modern equipment because he saw dollar signs, one recording stated. Tommy chose the old tractor because he understood its history and meaning. That difference in perspective tells me everything I need to know about who should inherit the responsibility of managing our family's legacy. The court ultimately ruled that Grandpa had the legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit, and that his decision to keep certain assets secret didn't constitute fraud against other family members. Marcus's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't file another challenge to the inheritance. Chapter 11. The Reconciliation Attempt. After losing his lawsuit, Marcus disappeared from my life for almost a year. He sold the equipment he'd inherited from Grandpa and moved to another state, apparently unable to deal with the humiliation of discovering that his successful brother had inherited 20 times more wealth than he had. But eventually, he reached out with what seemed like a genuine attempt at reconciliation. He called on Christmas morning, his voice subdued and lacking the arrogance that had characterized our previous conversations. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," he said. "I was angry and hurt, but I've had time to process it all. I think I understand now why Grandpa made the choices he did." Marcus explained that losing the lawsuit had forced him to examine his own values and priorities. He'd realized that his dismissal of the old tractor had been symbolic of his dismissal of everything that Grandpa had represented: tradition, family history, and the value of things that couldn't be measured in dollars. "I spent so much time building my career and making money that I forgot what really mattered," he admitted. Grandpa saw that, and he knew I wasn't ready for the responsibility of managing our family's legacy. I was cautiously optimistic about Marcus's apparent change of heart, but I was also wary of another manipulation attempt. The lawsuit had revealed a side of my brother that I'd never seen before, a willingness to destroy family relationships for financial gain. "What do you want from me?" I asked directly. "I want to be part of the family again," he said. "I don't expect you to share the inheritance, but I'd like to be involved in whatever you're building with it. I want to learn from you the way I should have learned from Grandpa." Over the following months, Marcus gradually proved that his change was genuine. He moved back to the area, took a job with a local business, and began spending time learning about farming and land management. Most importantly, he developed a real appreciation for the old John Deere tractor and what it represented. Chapter 12. The Legacy continues. 2 years after hearing Grandpa's voice through the radio, I had transformed his hidden empire into something even more impressive. The properties he'd assembled were generating substantial income through sustainable farming, selective development, and careful resource management. But more importantly, I was using that wealth to continue the work Grandpa had started, supporting the local community, helping young farmers get started, and preserving the agricultural heritage that had defined our area for generations. Marcus had become a valuable partner in these efforts, using his business skills to help manage the more complex aspects of the operation. His experience in real estate development proved useful for the properties that were suitable for commercial use, while his financial background helped optimize our investment strategies. "I understand now why Grandpa chose you," Marcus said one day as we worked together to restore another piece of vintage farm equipment. "It wasn't about who was more successful or who made more money. It was about who understood the real value of what he'd built." The old John Deere tractor had become the centerpiece of a small museum we'd established to preserve local agricultural history. Visitors could see the restored machine and learn about the technology that had revolutionized farming in the post-war era. But only Marcus and I knew about the radio system and the recordings that had revealed our family's hidden legacy. We'd agreed to keep that secret, understanding that some knowledge was too powerful to share widely. The tractor still ran perfectly, and occasionally I would start it up and listen to Grandpa's voice sharing memories, advice, and stories about our family's history. The radio had become a bridge between generations, allowing his wisdom to guide our decisions long after his death. "You chose well, Tommy," his voice had said in one of the final recordings I'd discovered. "You understood that the real treasure wasn't in the tractor itself, but in what the tractor represented. Our family's connection to the land, our respect for history, and our commitment to building something that would last beyond our own lifetimes." Chapter 13. The Full Circle. 5 years after Marcus had dismissed the junk tractor, we stood together in the equipment barn looking at a collection of restored vintage machinery that had become the foundation for a thriving agritourism business. The old John Deere Model B sat in the place of honor, still functional and still containing its secret radio system. The properties Grandpa had secretly assembled were now generating over $2 million in annual income, making our family one of the most successful agricultural operations in the state. But we'd also use that wealth to establish scholarship programs, support sustainable farming initiatives, and preserve thousands of acres of farmland for future generations. "I can't believe I almost missed all of this," Marcus said, running his hand along the tractor's restored fender. "If you hadn't been stubborn enough to restore this old machine, we never would have discovered what Grandpa had really built." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Marcus's dismissal of the tractor as worthless junk had been the key to my inheriting everything Grandpa had worked to create. His focus on modern, expensive equipment had blinded him to the real treasure that was hidden in plain sight. "Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing," I replied. "He understood that the person who would appreciate this tractor's history and significance would also be the person who could appreciate the responsibility that came with managing our family's legacy." We'd also discovered that the radio system in the tractor was even more sophisticated than we'd initially realized. Grandpa had been recording conversations and observations for over 30 years, creating an oral history of our family and community that was invaluable for understanding how rural life had changed over the decades. The recordings had revealed stories about neighbors, local history, and family traditions that would have been lost forever if not for Grandpa's foresight in preserving them. "Every time I start this engine, I'm reminded that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that other people overlook," I said, patting the tractor's hood. "Grandpa taught us that real wealth isn't just about money. It's about understanding what's truly worth preserving and having the wisdom to recognize value where others see only junk." The old tractor that Marcus had rejected had become the key to unlocking a legacy that would benefit our family and community for generations to come. And every time its engine ran, Grandpa's voice was there to remind us that the best inheritances are the ones that teach us who we really are. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of hidden treasures, family wisdom, and the power of recognizing value where others see only junk. This tale reminds us that the most precious inheritances are often disguised as the least valuable gifts, and that true wealth lies in understanding the stories and history behind the things we inherit. The story of Grandpa's talking tractor shows us that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and wisdom to look beyond surface appearances and discover the deeper meaning beneath. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and share any experiences you've had with discovering hidden value in things that others dismissed as worthless, or finding unexpected messages from loved ones who have passed away. If this story amazed you and made you think differently about the seemingly ordinary objects in your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others. These stories matter because they remind us that love and wisdom can find ways to reach us across time and space, and that the most important messages are often hidden in the most unexpected places. Until next time, remember that the most valuable inheritances are often the ones that require us to work the hardest to understand their true worth, and that sometimes the voice of wisdom speaks to us through the most unlikely messengers.